So far in these talks, I've established that man is a machine. Man exists in sleep, which itself is a very low level of consciousness, with consciousness being in fact made up of 4 levels of consciousness, itself really being a matter of attention of the function of consciousness. Consciousness itself is a degree of attention with respect to one's reality. Now, in this talk, I'll discuss knowledge and being, 2 factors in man's development which must proceed equally along 2 parallel lines. One shouldn't really progress further than the other, though this is likely to happen, especially in the Western world, as I will show. To paraphrase Peter Ouspensky, we often think about the growth or progression of our knowledge, specifically our knowledge, what we know. We recognize in the West that learning more is important. Studying more is important. Getting more education is important. But we rarely, if ever, stop to think about the equally pressing need to progress our being. In fact, in the West, we may even be quite hostile to the idea that there is more to one's self-development than simply being more knowledgeable. As language here is of critical importance, and of critical importance generally in the work, that is, Gurdjieff always spoke with an extremely precise language, which all in the work should learn and agree upon. I need to expand upon these 2 terms, knowledge and being. I will begin actually with the latter, with being. So, for many, being, and thus what it is to be, is synonymous, or the same as, existence itself, existing. And yet, as I've spoken about, it's clearly possible to exist in many different ways, on many different levels. So if we move away only from the existence of man here, if we move into the general spectrum of what it is to exist, we can't look at the existence of a stone, a plant, a dog, and a man, and state that all exist in the same way. And therefore, from this, we cannot state that each has the exact same being, and thereby we can't argue for an equal state of being generally. And also from this, we can't argue that 2 men would have the same being, that one man would have the same level of being as another man, as shown in the levels of consciousness. As there are differences between the existence of a stone, a plant, a dog, and a man, and the different levels of existence between these, there is also unequal being between men. And this difference is rarely seen. It's rarely agreed. It's rarely taken as something that could even be. And simply put, in the work, the being of men is not equal. Now, let me turn to knowledge. Something which is understood in the work as dependent on a man's being. In the West, once again, with our culture of credentialism, productivity, and academic wiseacring, as Gurdjieff would put it, it's understood that if a man is disciplined enough in his pursuit of knowledge, that he can acquire any knowledge he sets his targets on, whilst simultaneously abiding by the erroneous perspective that whatever knowledge he so acquired, he would actually understand just because he had acquired it. That is to say, in the West, we abide by the principle that just because one has acquired a gargantuan education and has read many, many books, that they, because of this, they understand everything they read. There is a key difference between knowledge and understanding. For Western man, being is understood to have no effect on his knowledge, his understanding of that knowledge. This perspective, as seen from the position of the work and of Gurdjieff, is the same as stating that a man can become great in his discipline without himself having to change. That is, a man could become great whilst remaining in sleep. As one may see from the previous talks, this simply can't be. There has to be some form of shock to awake you, and you have to change in your person. Otherwise, you're simply kept in this realm of knowledge. Your line of being doesn't progress, and your understanding halts. Those in the East, however, understood that if a man's knowledge progressed beyond his being, you can think of being and knowledge as two lines which are heading in the same direction, sometimes getting out of joint with each other, but hopefully being equal in length and progressing equally. And it's understood in the East that if the line of knowledge progressed beyond man's being, it would slowly become useless. The further knowledge progresses beyond being, the less and less its applicability to life itself. Knowledge of this kind, which stretches far beyond one's being, becomes fragmented, detached. In the end, knowledge of this kind has no means of understanding and only complicates a man's life further. He simply does not know what to do with it. In dealing with being, we are dealing with our weaknesses, primarily our weakness with sleep, which really is the primary weakness of all men. In dealing with knowledge, we are reading theory, acquiring a knowing. If our knowledge outgrows our being, we will know what to do, but won't be able to do it. And if our being outgrows our knowledge, we shall acquire powers and yet have no idea with what to do with them. The two need to be equal for these reasons. You need to be able to do, but you also need to be able to know why it is you are doing. As I've already stated, we mistake our knowledge for understanding. As Uspensky makes clear, knowledge is one thing, understanding another. There is a gulf between them, and this gulf is related to being. Just because a man knows something doesn't mean he understands it. And likewise, just because a man understands something does not actually mean he knows it. Understanding is a relationship between knowledge and being. Kenneth Walker regards it as being the resultant of the two. Understanding expands one's relationship with the object in question. It is not simply knowledge about the object at hand, but the object's relationship with something bigger, an expansion. Its place within the whole, not existing as a piece of knowledge in part. Walker gives the examples of cell and body, man and mankind, mankind and organic life and the earth and the sun and the solar system and the universe. And it's in this understanding of the micro to the macro that you have a true understanding and an expansion, and you don't simply remain within the micro as a fragmented part which you misunderstand as understanding itself. Understanding works for the whole, knowledge accepts a part. Every moment of understanding, every realization sheds light, not only on the thing we are thinking about, but on many other things as well. That's Uspensky. The West, in its reverence of specialism, accreditation, credentialism, is far ahead where knowledge is concerned. But due to its focus on the part over the whole, those who have a credential for an extremely specific thing, it lags far behind where understanding is concerned, and thus where being is concerned. Uspensky also points to the use of language as a distinctly Western problem. We, as all and as I, can speak of practical problems without descending into subjective meaning of the words used. Mechanics, for instance, from across the map can discuss the problems of an engine using a very precise language of their specialty. They can all speak amongst one another and understand exactly what it is they're talking about. But as our conversations enter into more abstract realms, our language becomes increasingly subjective, and a single sentence may have two entirely different meanings for two different men. But in speaking to each other, they can often believe they have come to the same conclusion, despite both still existing in their own subjective points of view. This is because man does not know himself once again. We cannot repeat what we have heard without changing it, without one of our centers taking over the knowledge and processing it either intellectually, emotionally, or perhaps even physically. We do not understand our mechanicalness. We do not know ourselves. Our manner of speech is mechanic. I ask you to think back to the previous talk on the different minds or different centers of man. When we look at what understanding is, we can see that it is truly understanding in more than one center. In fact, in all three chief centers. Let us take, as Walker does, the idea of sleep. And this is to paraphrase Kenneth Walker. When the idea of sleep is first explained to man, he accepts it, perhaps, if he truly did, though many are very hostile and don't fully accept it. He accepts it first in his intellectual center, perhaps for Western man the easiest center to accept things in. He theorizes it, he applies logic to it, he reasons it, he ruminates on this idea of man asleep, of man as a machine, knowing it in his intellectual center to perhaps be a reasonable idea, and he cross-references this throughout his daily life via his intellectual center, reasoning and rationalizing it. And as he continues to work on himself, to observe himself, the day perhaps would eventually arrive when he would feel the mechanicalness of the world around him, of the men he greets. He would know emotionally in his emotional center what it is to be swept up in the tide of sleep, to feel what it is to be a machine, to feel what it is to be a machine. In this moment, he would gain emotional knowledge of the idea. The idea of man's mechanicality passes from the sphere of the intellectual center, the sphere of theory, into that of practice, of emotion, and he would have quite a different knowledge of this idea. Likewise, there may come a time when mechanicalness and the idea of man as machine is understood in his moving center, and thus in all three chief centers at that point. In such a moment, the idea would move entirely into the realm of understanding. He would have its whole, for he has a knowledge of it in all three centers, and he can apply this together into a full understanding, which isn't applying itself to the subjective language of a single center. It is assessing the whole in all three centers. In correlation with man's development in terms of this idea of waking up from sleep, be it in connection with multiple centers, man's understanding progresses. So when we look back at these two lines, that of knowledge and of being, we notice that in contemporary society, if one is so inclined, knowledge is easily accessible, easy to obtain in gratuitous abundance. We must, then, set our aim as to progress our being, making our chief efforts then to struggle against sleep. And here we can think back to observation. For if, in understanding, we are dealing with more than one center, with the potential to understand from multiple centers, not parts but wholes, then we must at first observe ourselves and our centers. If we know not which center speaks in our understanding, how can we hope to increase it? How can we hope to develop our understanding if we have no observation of which center it is that is trying to know something, and thereby see where our subjective weaknesses lie? Let us think back to the talk on consciousness of man number 1, man number 2, and man number 3, and man number 4. That is, the man of the moving center, the man of the emotional center, the man of the intellectual center, and man number 4, the man whose centers no longer overtake one another, he who has a real center of gravity. Who of these men can understand the other? Men 1, 2, and 3 cannot understand one another. They all speak different languages. They all speak from different centers. They all speak from different eyes. There is no master. Their communication is entirely subjective. Words and language only begins to acquire objective meaning at the level of man number 4 and above. Those who have a full understanding. If you'd like to take these ideas seriously and sincerely, please find information about it in the description.